Chairman, let me first thank you for facilitating my attendance here today, and I want to welcome the guests and thank them for a very comprehensive opening statement from both sides. First thing I would like you to address, and I asked the Taoiseach to address this yesterday, and they have given an undertaking that the Department of Foreign Affairs will set out a briefing document for members of the Oireachtas as to what Irish neutrality is. Because I believe we have never had it defined in the 102 odd years that we've been around. Because we frequently hear terms of Ireland is politically neutral, or Ireland is militarily neutral and non-aligned. We fail to understand that these are opposite poles when it comes to discussing things. So I'm wondering if either of you would care to try and put a definition on Irish neutrality, or paddy neutrality as I frequently refer to it, because it is becoming quite embarrassing when we travel overseas now. When you talk to members of other, I recently attended a conference in Bruges, Foreign Affairs and Defence of the 27. And at that conference, the issue, I'm talking about the sidebar conversations, the issue of Ireland's neutrality is in some cases being regarded as a butt of a joke, and in more cases it's been regarded as a serious threat to the western flank of Europe. So I'm just wondering if you have had anything. I disagree with you, Dr. McDonagh, insofar as I think the forum organised by the Taoiseach was quite brave, because it kicked topics out into the public that had been for years suppressed. So I don't believe it achieved what it set out to do, but I believe it started the conversation, and we needed to start that. And that brings me on to our defence forces. In this illustrious establishment, when people talk about the defence forces, it's my view that they categorise our defence forces into one of two categories. The local authority corporation who will pick up the bus strikes, collect the bins, clean the snow off the footpaths, and they're lovely guys in uniform anytime a new ambassador arrives in the country, and the only other role they have in the world is peacekeeping. We fail to take cognizance of the fact that our EOD people are out almost once, if not twice a week. We fail to take account of the several other mandatorily, statutorily tasked objectives that the defence forces have within the country. And talking to two guys in civvies here, there is really a knownness on all of us to get into the public domain what it is we do, what it is our defence forces are there for, because I think they are greatly misunderstood. The intelligence service, or the lack of an intelligence service in Ireland. We have the Gardaí double-hatted with some intelligence and normal policing. Do you see the lack of an intelligence service similar to the CIA or MI5 or MI6? Do you see that as limiting? You speak about how we can be in attendance at various committees in Europe and elsewhere, but there's a point at which we're no longer required in the room, or if we're in the room, we have no direct input. Is the lack of an intelligence agency in some way hampering Ireland's position? Now, a couple of other things. The Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean carries massive assets for Europe, and many of those assets pass through our economic zone. It is as plain as the nose on my face that we are incapable of patrolling that area. But even if we had the 9 ships at sea, we still couldn't cover the level of Atlantic cover that needs. And I've proposed at that meeting in Bruges the establishment of a European Atlantic fleet outside of NATO that would have arrest capacity at anywhere in Europe. The only caveat would be that an arrested ship would be landed at the nearest port, wherever that would be. So you could conceivably have a German ship arrest a ship in Irish waters, but they'd have to bring that ship into Ireland and whatever action. And we're not necessarily talking about military here, we're talking about drugs, we're talking about people trafficking, anything like that. Would you see that something as that might fly? It certainly flew in Bruges when I spoke to them. Regarding MOUs, I couldn't possibly discuss them. I'm to my neck in that at the moment. So when that's over, we'll have a chat on that. You spoke about research, and you know, I know there's research in military equipment in Carlow, for example, right? Is the lack of a centralised research agency, if you want? We discussed this yesterday in relation to cyber. There is lots of cyber research going on in the country, but there is no statutory body with oversight of that, that all of these research agencies that would feed into, so as we would have a coordinated approach to our research. Do you think that under the guise of a central research body that we could pull in military and pull in cyber, and how do you think that would improve things? I'm sorry I'm throwing a lot at you, but I want to try and get as much as I can in. We can't be members of NATO currently for a number of reasons, not least of which there's neither the political will nor the public will to be a part of NATO. But the North Atlantic is opening up. Climate change will bring new shipping pathways into the north of Europe, and it will be in our strategic interest to ensure that that passageway is protected. It has already been established that there is a joint expeditionary force. From the somewhat limited definition of our neutrality we have, would you see joining an expeditionary force as being anathema to any notion of neutrality in the country? And I'm coming to an end. You mentioned the attack on a European partner. I've been over and back to Estonia quite a number of times on cyber programs and bringing delegations there. One of the things that I notice when I arrive in Tallinn is the number of military uniforms from all over Europe, and that includes the UK. The UK may be outside Europe, but it's not outside NATO, so you find their pilots, for example, I was with the Royal Dragoons a couple of weeks ago, they're heading to Estonia for a 6-month posting very soon. I think it's going to be a huge game changer if there's an attack on European soil from a member state. And leaving aside everything else, have we got an obligation to our partners in Europe to support them? And my very last question is in the area of weaponry, ammunition. I agree totally with you with respect to the weapons and ammunition we have. It would be a token gesture. Some of them are at the end of their life cycle, and in fact it would be cheaper to have them shot at Russians than to have them destroyed. So I just don't understand why we don't hand them over. But because if you're dealing with the US, you have a standardized system, so they have a standard number of weapons, they have standard helicopters, standard aircraft, standard ammunition. Within Europe, we have a mixed match. As you rightly point out, different countries have different priorities. Is that going to limit the capacity to support Ukraine? Where you, for example, can't get the same rifle ammunition. You know, you might be using 7.62, I might be using 5.5 or 303 or whatever. Is that going to be a problem for Europe? The establishment of a defence commissioner might resolve some of those problems. So I'm sorry, that's a lot of stuff. If you don't mind, I'll leave it at that. You may be getting an invitation back to the Foreign Affairs and Defence Chairman. Really good to have these people here. We might bring them over to our committee. Thank you.
Well, there's such a shortage of questions there to answer. But anyway, whoever would like to start, Ben is indicating. Work away and divide them out between you.
I'm going to take the top and tail of those questions. In terms of the tail, interoperability isn't an issue. NATO has set the standards across Europe. Those are the standards that all NATO states work to. Those are the standards to which Ukraine works to, and indeed the standards that Ireland operates to through NATO's Partnership for Peace. So that really isn't an issue any longer. So therefore, all the Irish ammunition, what we could send, could be used if we chose to send it, and the only reason we don't send it is a line in the programme for government. With respect to neutrality, if there's one document I would look forward to more than the MOU on the RAF, it would be the Department of Foreign Affairs, as you tell me now, document coming out on neutrality. Because let's start with first principles. You know, neutrality is not taking sides in other people's disputes. It is the moral equivalent of walking past a burning building and saying, that's not my problem. Ireland has been neutral once in the Second World War, where we did not take sides in that dispute. Now, we can have a whole other conversation about what we did and what we didn't do and what it really meant, but formally we were neutral, just like Sweden. Sweden's neutrality was compromised as well, but it was neutral. Since the Second World War, however, Ireland has never been politically neutral on anything. And I'm glad of that. Ireland has taken a position. It has applied its values, applied its interests on whatever dispute, whatever international controversy. Ireland has always taken a position, and it's to the credit of Irish foreign policymakers through the decades that they always have. So, you know, forgive me, but the Consultative Forum did not invent the notion of political alignment and military neutrality. The definition of neutrality then is the problem, because what we have in this country is debate about people who don't agree on the definition of the thing they're talking about, which, to my experience as recently as last night, results in people shouting at one another about neutrality when they're talking about something completely different. The government, and this is not this government, it's all Irish governments stretching back, have traditionally defined Irish neutrality as, traditional military neutrality as non-membership of a security alliance. I'm very sorry to say that is nobody else's definition of neutrality. Nobody. Because it's not the status of being neutral. Using that rubric, the People's Republic of China is neutral. It's not. So therefore, that's the government's definition. For those who are very passionate about neutrality, they put a lot of other things on top of that. They talk about an anti-colonial policy, an anti-imperial policy, a pro-peace policy, a pro-development policy. But none of those things are about neutrality. In fact, they're the antithesis of neutrality, because you're about taking sides and deciding who are the bad guys and who are the good guys. That's not neutrality. So again, you have a dialogue of people shouting at each other about a definition which doesn't apply. I think what you're going to see, and I'll make a prediction, I think what you're going to see from the Department of Foreign Affairs is a document that's going to center on non-membership of a security alliance, and then they're going to add all the bells and whistles in the world. It'll be like a Christmas tree. Our neutrality means that we're good people, and we provide development aid, and we promoters of human rights, and we're in favor of gender rights, and we're in favor of peace, and we're in favor of peacemaking, and we're in favor, and we're in favor, and we're in favor. None of that has anything to do with neutrality. Because, and I'll bar one issue, and you can ask me about it, bar one issue, you can pick any of those issues, any of those Christmas lights that the Department of Foreign Affairs is going to put on their memorandum to you. Take any one of those Christmas lights, and I will find you a NATO member state who does it more and does it better, whether it's development, or peacekeeping, or human rights, or gender rights, or global justice, or diplomacy, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have convinced ourselves that Irish neutrality is a thing, but it's nobody else's thing, and it's not neutrality.
Okay.
Thought of that, Jim. So, maybe just to pick up on the point of neutrality, I think Ben has summarised it quite well in terms of. So, the question I'd always ask, it's not a definition we need. We need to ask, what does neutrality do in the context of the political debate? And it's something that has moved in an Irish context, I think, into the realm of an identity and a value, rather than something that's a rational assessment of a set of policy options. And that's why the debate quickly becomes heated and very little light gets shed. And in that context, that was the disappointment I had with the Consultative Forum. So I just want to clarify, I did think it was a great idea to have it, and that's why I participated. But it was the outcome, and that it descended into, to give the panel I was on was about NATO partnership, and we had a serving Irish naval officer who was seconded to NATO. We had someone from NATO, we had another academic, but it quickly became a shouting match about things that had nothing to do with anything the panelists had said. Instead of asking, well, what does our partnership with NATO means? What does Ireland get out of it? What does NATO get out of it? Could we move further? Should we step away from it? And that kind of positive discussion. And that's because we were bringing facts to a values fight, for want of a better term. And so approaching that question is going to be very tricky, as we've seen in our near neighbour. When values are on the table, facts can sometimes be much more malleable or much more manipulated than they are elsewhere. On the point of the intelligence services, just to go back to that specific question, I think it's a real issue. Ben has already alluded to the questions around security clearance, whether that's for officials or for those in the private sector or in the academic sector. It's a barrier. But it's also a case of just prudence on the part of a state. I mean, we have friends and they're good friends and we like them, but there's no harm in having a capability to verify certain things because those friends have interests as well, and they may not always fully align with our own interests. And again, we've seen that with our recent relations with the close neighbour post-Brexit. You know, we've seen points of clash where we might want to, you know, be wary about what things might roll over into other issue areas like security. So I do think it's a major gap. And the third part of that is, of course, you know, that democratic oversight piece that, you know, you need to have intelligence gathering, you need to have informed security decision making, and you need to have opportunities for people from opposition parties in perhaps enclosed meetings of committees like this to interrogate that and say, are we making real decisions based on good evidence, or, you know, is this evidence being skewed? And without our own capability in that regard, I think it's a serious gap. On the Atlantic Ocean, yeah, it's a big place, and even with nine ships and a few more planes, it wouldn't be possible for Ireland to police that on its own. And the reality is we already don't. We already cooperate with a number of European bodies and international bodies when it comes to things like drug interdiction. We saw the effect of that last year with a very significant haul, and it would seem that a more military element to that would be a logical extension, at least in terms of having the capability. If you want to call it a Coast Guard rather than a naval mission instead, that might be one option on it. But I think it would very quickly run into the quagmire of debates around what this would mean for neutrality. That if these active missions were then coming back to Ireland, but perhaps in a drug interdiction sense or trafficking or smuggling sense, that might be something that connects it to people's lived reality in a way that our lived reality of the security threats aren't necessarily there. On research, the idea of, you know, no academics are going to say no to more research funding, but I do think it's something worth exploring. But one of the questions I would have if you're going to set up this kind of institution is what would it be coordinated to? You know, we still lack a clear statement by the government of these are the threats and risks that Ireland faces, these are the capabilities we have to deal with them, and these are the gaps that we need to address. So without that sort of foundation, you know, that there isn't really any point in creating a research agency because it wouldn't have a centre of gravity towards which it would be working.
Just while you're thinking there, can I come in on two supplementaries? One is the lack of an intelligence committee in the Oireachtas. You seem to feel that is a serious deficiency, if you want, in our oversight. And the second one is, as academics, have you ever been brought into a central forum by any government and asked to lay out what your priorities in research might be and to allow government to adjudicate as to where we put money? Or are we still piecemeally putting money into one project and another project, and people are begging for crumbs at the table? Whereas I would love to see a sort of a group of academics who would advise government, and I would pick one from each college or a number from each college to ensure that we get over the rivalry thing. But we don't seem to have a research policy. That's I guess what I'm hitting at. And it doesn't have to be military. Cyber at the moment is massive. And we just don't seem to have a policy. I think there are about 20 different cyber research projects at the moment, but there is nobody coordinating all of those. And that worries me.
And Senator Craughwell would prefer that they would be academics that would agree with him.
Well, as my favourite expression goes, you always seek opinion which is just about plus or minus 5% of your own opinion. And then you just find that opinion as being balanced and fair.
Absolutely.
So I think we're all guilty of that. But just unconscious if you want to come back in on any of this supplemental that you're asked, Ben. Yep.
Just briefly, I mean, I think your question about the Defence Forces, your question about an intelligence service, your question about research, I mean, to my mind, they all revolve around one particular issue, and that is the absence of a national conversation on defence and the absence of a national security culture. We've been blessed for 80 years that we didn't have to think about defending ourselves, other than the crisis in Northern Ireland. So the state was totally consumed with looking at sort of the on-island issues. And we were blessed for 800 years. Now, for 80 years. For 800 years, we were cursed by our geography. So as I say to my international students who complain about Irish neutrality and talk about free riding, you know, I say, we had it bad for 800 years, you know, we're entitled to the 80 that we've had. My only point is, I think the 80 is coming to an end in terms of these issues are now really important and will be striking at us. And because we haven't had to have those conversations for all the best reasons in the world, it's tough for us to gear up and to begin to think about it. And it's basic stuff. Again, you know, national security clearance. We still have 2 government departments, you know, urinating into the wind, will I say, in terms of whose responsibility this is going to be and who's going to pay for it. But we have real live issues in terms of the fact that, you know, we have people, you know, foreign nationals working in state agencies who don't have security clearance. We have, as I say again, Irish academics who can't serve on various expert committees because there's no system of national security clearance. We don't have a national security strategy. We don't have an integrated, you know, concept of defense. We don't have, you know, there's so much missing. But it all comes down to that one point, that we don't take defense seriously. And I don't want to get into the whole row about should we have a defense minister, should we not, but that is simply emblematic of that much bigger conversation that still needs to be had. And I think it's a shame if we're forced to have that conversation because other people in Europe are having it and suddenly we have to make up our minds at the last minute. It would be so much better if we decided what our defense strategy was, how it was to be executed, and take the political choices with the costs and benefits that arise there from those choices.